Wonderful. So I am Shayna Lang. If I have not met you before, connected with you via email, I am our community engagement manager for IN Pathways to Inclusive Higher Education. And so IN is a nonprofit here in the state of Colorado. We work across the entire state to help institutions of higher ed develop inclusive programs for students with intellectual disabilities, to help them develop academically, socially, and vocationally. And that kind of naturally incorporates some independence as well. And so that's really our mission. We want to see all higher education institutions welcome the population of students that we work with intellectual disabilities. And these are kind of the categories of how we do what we do. So we reach out to educators and we do education on how to best prepare students with disabilities for college. We do lots of outreach to families, and this is a part of that, so that families and students with disabilities understand that college is an option for them. We also work on expansion, so connecting with institutions of higher ed and equipping them to develop these programs. And we're running expansion grants right now from dollars from the Department of Higher Ed, and we're super grateful for that to see more and more schools come up in the state of Colorado. And then we also track our outcomes because that shows us the value of these types of programs. And we won't, typically our webinars are really focused on inclusive higher education programs. This webinar is a bit unique in that we're trying to zoom out a bit and take a look at all disability services so that you can really determine where your student or the students you serve, which category they fall into, and then you can see which one you need to dig into a bit more. So ours will be a bit different for this webinar, but just wanted to give you context of who we are and where most of our content lays is with this type of population. So this is our small team of 3. We have our executive director, Tracy Murphy, myself, our community engagement manager, and then Elise Kramer. She's our program coordinator, and she's here on the call for us as well, probably helping with any questions that come through. All of our contact information is there so that you do reach out to us. We want to be a resource to you. I know that supporting any student to go to college can feel really daunting, let alone a student with a disability, let alone a student with intellectual disability. So there's so many layers and questions and concerns, and so we want to be available to you. So feel free, please, to contact us directly. Elise and I are probably going to be your go-to to answer just basic questions. So feel free to jot down our email or our number and reach out. So here's where we're headed today for the next hour. I'm going to start with just addressing history of disability services in higher ed, just kind of giving you that picture, the law behind these things. And then we're going to take a look at 3 available service categories. These are categories that are common terminology for other people, but it's really what we speak to. So hopefully I can break that down for you. And then we're going to talk a bit more about those inclusive higher education programs that I mentioned that we really work with and how they're beyond compliant. And we'll speak about that language. And then really my hope for you all by the time that we wrap up this hour is you can identify which category the students you're thinking of or the students you have in your home or your classroom, you can figure out which category they fall into, and then you can resource them accordingly. So it's really the hope that it gives you clarity and helps you figure out which path is the best for your students. So real quick, I'm not going to go into all of the nitty gritty of these laws. I think I geek out on laws of disability services more than most people, and so I won't go into all of it, but I do want to give you guys a picture, especially when we're talking about the whole of disability services. It's important to see kind of the layer of laws that have gone into place over time to support those types of services. So over on the far left, you're going to see those 2 blue panels from 1973 and 1990. These are laws that were put in place that we refer to as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, commonly just referred to as ADA. These were put into place to ensure that students that are going to college that meet essential functions and have a disability would be able to have, would not be discriminated against, that they would be able to actually enroll, and also that they would have access to accommodations while they're there. And there's a key word in all of that, that's appropriate accommodations, and we'll speak about that. So this is really for your typical college student that might have additional disabilities, and it was allowing them to get some support in those college experiences. And then in 2008, which I know is a ways past all of that, there's this group of students who were coming from K-12 from the special education track, primarily in removed classrooms, and they were coming to graduation and not really having much to do after K-12. And so there's this movement nationally to say, hey, we believe that higher education impacts everybody and makes a difference and improves the lives of everybody, and we want to create pathways for all. And so in 2008, this law, the Federal Reauthorization of Higher Ed Opportunity Act, was specifically to create funding for programs for students with intellectual disabilities, students that traditionally had not gone to college because of their cognitive level, not being able to meet entrance criteria, etc. So that happened at the national level, and slowly but surely, states all across the nation started picking up these programs. And Colorado was late to the game, but we jumped in 2016. And we established 3 pilot programs, and now we're expanding to be upwards of 8 by next year. So this is kind of just the trajectory of like different categories of students with disabilities that have been served in higher education at large. And hopefully this just kind of breaks down some of those categories a bit. But really where we're going to camp out is what are those 3 levels of disability services that we see at the higher education level. And I do want to speak to my background so that you guys know that I'm not just spewing this out. So I have worked in disability services at higher education institutions. So I've gone through this process with several students with a variety of disabilities. I've also worked in our inclusive higher education programs where we're working with more intensive needs students. So please ask me direct questions because I've had experience in this, and I think it's really important for families and students to be aware of. So we're going to start with this first category. It's the most broad, and I'm just going to refer to it as traditional disability services. Okay. And I'm going to go into more depth of how students access this when they get to college, but we're just going to kind of look at the categories on the front end. So when we're thinking about traditional disability services, this is for students that meet college entry criteria. So they may have to take that ACT test to get in. And a lot of colleges have removed that, but they have completed high school with a traditional diploma. They might have a GPA requirement, and these students have met that criteria. And they are for students that are going to be degree seeking. Okay, so they're for students that are taking classes for credit after a degree, after a plan of study. And this is going to be really pivotal language that you'll start to hear as you pursue higher education, but disability services is for students who can meet course essential functions or standards. That's higher education language for essentially saying, can you do the things that are going to be required of you in this course? Can you complete a 5-page paper? Can you take a written exam? Those are called essential functions, what's going to be expected of all students. And these are for those that can do those things, okay? And then within disability services, traditional disability services, they only provide accommodations to students. And this is a big shift from K-12. So typically in K-12, whether students are on an IEP or a 504 plan, there tends to be more gray area around the types of services that they receive academically, where they might be receiving accommodations to content, but they also might be receiving modifications. Once we get to higher education and you're in this traditional disability services category, modifications are not available at the college level. They need to make sure that all the students in those courses are pursuing the same outcome or achieving those same standards. And so only accommodations are approved. And we're going to talk about what are the common ones that we see. But I will note, because of those laws that I mentioned, traditional disability services exist to some extent at every single institution of higher education. It is required by law that they have somebody dedicated to support students with disabilities that are going to require accommodations. And so therefore there's no fee. This is just a part of what higher ed institutions offer. Okay. And then we have this middle ground, this second category that I call supplemental disability services. You might hear a lot of different terms for this. There's not one like clear-cut term across higher ed institutions, but this is the reason why I use supplemental. It just tends to be programs that offer just a little bit more than those traditional disability services. So this is still for students that meet traditional college entry criteria. They're admitted traditionally. They still are degree seeking, pursuing that associate's or bachelor's. They're meeting those essential functions. They only need accommodations. And where it's unique is they tend to support students more on that social organizational level. So this might be for students who struggle socially and how to engage. And so they might need additional support to develop those skills. Or maybe this is for students that cannot for the life of them keep a calendar organized. And so they need help with essential, executive functioning skills to be able to be successful. So they're not going to change the types of services available in the college classroom, but they offer a couple of wraparound supports to help students feel more successful and more able to attain their goals at the college level. This is not required at all institutions of higher ed. So this is going to be a little bit fewer and far between. So it's only available at select institutions that dedicate staff towards it. There's sometimes fees incorporated with this, and I will lean towards most often there are fees incorporated with this because it's an additional service. Additional staff members are offering support. So that's just important to note as you're looking at schools and acknowledging if there's additional charges. And then where in comes into play, and this is kind of this like deeper level of support, is inclusive higher education services. So this is for those students that don't meet college entry criteria and without these programs would not be able to pursue college. And we'll talk about how that's kind of set up for them. These are specifically for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities that are going to require more intensive supports. Primarily the category or the unique component is that they would require modification. So students that would not be able to meet those course essential functions without some kind of modification to the information. And because of that, they're going to want to pursue a certificate rather than your traditional associate's degree or bachelor's degree. It's a little bit more, it's a modified outcome to meet their specific needs. And then they're going to receive academic, social, vocational, and independent skill development support from the program themselves. So this is far more hands-on than the former two, and is really dedicated for students that otherwise could not pursue college without this type of program. Again, only available at a few colleges, not required by law by any means. The students have to apply to the program first in order to be admitted to the institution because it's not their traditional entry criteria. And then there are fees, guaranteed going to be fees for this type of service. So that's kind of the three categories we're looking at. I'm going to dive a bit more into how you access those different services as we keep moving. So I'm going to talk a good chunk of our time about your traditional disability services, because I think it's important whether students pursue any of those categories. It's kind of important to know what that baseline disability service layout is, because even with supplemental disability services or inclusive higher ed services, students are going to have to engage with their disability services office, which is where this one comes into play. So as I mentioned, legally mandated. So even if it's not broadcasted at an institution that you're looking at, they legally have to have at least one person dedicated to helping somebody that has a disability navigate college. So please ask. Please advocate. No matter where you're looking, it's really important that you reach out and you ask for who is the key person or which office you should be approaching. Students are going to be traditionally admitted and degree seeking. So students don't have to identify on their applications to the institution that they have a disability. You just complete your application as any other student would. And once you're admitted, then you pursue disability services and identify that you have a disability. So it's not something that should have to come up in your application. Some students choose to do that early on, and that's totally fine, but it's not something that's going to be required. I will note that students within this category have a wide range of disabilities. So it's going to cover a lot of different ground. So it might be a physical disability, it might be chronic health issues, could be autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, mental health. It could be a wide range of things. And even those students that have these types of disabilities may not have received services in K-12 for special education, so to speak, but I encourage them to pursue disability services in higher ed because there's lots of benefit to just having some of that support in place, because college is an increased level of rigor and can be really tricky to navigate. And again, students have to meet the essential functions of the course. So there can't be any alterations to what's expected of them in each of their courses. They're going to be graded according to those expectations. So let's talk a bit about what those accommodations tend to look like at the college level. So there's no alteration to what learning occurs. It's only alterations to how learning occurs or how it's shown. So students are going to be expected to every single student in the class may have to read 5 chapters in one night. But a student with accommodations might have access to audiobooks to be able to listen and read simultaneously. It's a change to how they're doing it, but the what or the outcome is the exact same as their peers. And the reason why this is really important and the language that you're going to see when you get to college and start talking with disability services is they're really trying to prepare all of their students for workforce expectations. So if students are getting into a job and they're expected to do specific outcomes, they want to know how they can do those well with accommodations if needed, but not asking for changes to that. So it's really to prepare them to bolster them up to be as ready as possible for their job and their career. So what are some common examples that we see of accommodations? And you're going to see these in a couple of categories. Primarily, the biggest one that we talk about is classroom accommodations or academic accommodations. Common ones are note takers. So if students need support with auditory processing and maybe taking notes is really tricky for them, they might have a peer taking notes for them. They might have assistive technology that records the class and transcribes notes for them to come back to. There are options within that, but that's a really common accommodation. Assistive technology, as I mentioned, that could include, audiobooks counts as assistive technology. It could also include like dictation devices. So being able to dictate words for an essay and then edit it from there rather than typing it all out. That's a common one that's utilized, or being able to have screen readers where things are read aloud to you to help with that processing. They might have alternate format textbooks, so large print, braille, all of those things. So those are pretty common when it comes to classroom accommodations, what would impact that classroom academics. Testing is also a really big category of these accommodations. A common one is extended time, and that again is for a wide range of disabilities, just for that processing time. So students might be able to get double time than their peers taking an exam. And a lot of times that coincides with having a quiet testing environment. So there typically is a testing center at each institution of higher ed where students schedule time in that testing center to complete an exam with their extended time. Or text to speech. So that might be a screen reader for an exam where they have questions being read aloud to them. Sometimes that can even be somebody from the Disability Services Office reading questions aloud to them if that helps them process better too. So there are some options within that, but those are really common. And then we also get into housing accommodations, which I think a lot of times I work with students that forget that's something they need to consider. It's not always just the academic world. Once you get to college, you got those housing components too that causes lots of change and lots of growth. And so you would still go through the Disability Services Office for housing questions, and they might route you to residence life, but it's important for them to know at the Disability Service Office, what are the needs that you have holistically? Okay, so that might be an emotional support animal where you have that at home and you need to get that approved to be on campus. That might mean that you require a single room. That could be for mental health concerns. That could be for physical needs, whatever it might be, or even an approval of a personal care attendant. So if you have a requirement to be flipped, several times throughout the night, you might need to hire somebody to do that and then have them approved to be on campus and stay in the dorms with you to be able to do those services. So all of that should start with your Disability Services Office to discuss what's going to be appropriate, what's available at the institution, and then go from there. These are not all inclusive of what accommodations are approved. That's just a really good starting point. I will point out that what accommodations are received in K-12 do not automatically carry over to higher ed. And that's sometimes pretty tricky for families or students to work with. It's a bit of a shift. By and large, most of the accommodations, testing accommodations and classroom accommodations are pretty common from K-12 to higher ed. And so you're going to see similarities. But just because a student received it in K-12 does not mean that a higher ed institution is going to provide it. And a lot of times what their questions tend to be is, does that alter the essential function of the course? So maybe an example with testing, if students were able to receive tests with maybe fewer questions, that technically is a modification. So if you were to come through Disability Services Office, they're going to say, hey, that actually alters the essential function or purpose of this full exam, and we can't do that. You have to answer all the same questions. You have to have all the same choices as any other student to make sure that everybody's meeting that same standard. So that's just important to note that there's going to be some conversation around this. So once a student is admitted to the institution, once they're in this category, this is what they want to pursue. They apply traditionally, they're admitted. Now it's their job to self-advocate or request accommodations from the Disability Services Office. Sometimes that's an online form, sometimes that's a phone call, sometimes that's just walking straight into the Disability Services Office. Wide range of ways to do that, but there is an advocacy need. They're not going to come and approach students saying, hey, I saw this on your application, or I don't know how else they would know it, but they're not going to come find students with disabilities. So there has to be a self-disclosure. Okay. And then it's a very interactive process. So this is also sometimes a big shift from K-12 where students kind of passively receive accommodations and support. That's not the case here in higher ed. They have to be very active in this process and determining what's appropriate for them. So they're going to self-disclose to their Disability Services Office. And then a part of that process is providing documentation. So there has to be clear documentation of an identified diagnosed disability. Okay. And an IEP or a 504 plan are not automatically accepted as documentation. A lot of times they're going to be looking for psychological documentation, doctor notes, things like that to really get a whole picture of what a student's disability is. So it's important for students to know where to find that information, to provide that information, and to have conversation with disability services early on to ask what documentation requirements are needed. Some institutions require that all documentation is within the past 3 years, so they require some recent assessments. I don't think that that's the most common, but again, it's going to be a bit nuanced from each institution, so make sure you request that. Yep, and one of the big things when we look at documentation is that there's a clearly stated diagnosis. That's an important piece for them to be able to approve a student. Once that's identified, this is a student with a disability, then it goes into more of a discussion. Okay, what are the educational and disability related needs that you have? What accommodations did you use in K-12? Which ones were helpful? Which ones weren't? And it's a very interactive conversation to kind of see what the best or most important things are for the student. And then the student and a disability services staff member are going to determine what are those appropriate accommodations. So they should be able to explain to students, here's what we're approving as your accommodations, and here's why. And from there, students then receive what we call an accommodation letter. So this again is another big shift. I worked with several students that just thought providing their 504 from high school to their faculty members would do the trick. Faculty at college have no idea what 504s are. They have no idea what an IEP is. That is not something they're expected to know. And so that throws them for a loop. What they will know is an accommodation letter from that institution of higher ed. And it's different formats. Some of them is purely electronic. Some of it's a physical copy. But it's going to be provided by that institution of higher ed. And it's going to have clarity about their procedures and all of those things. So it's a brand new document that students have to have access to. And that becomes kind of their guide for talking with professors. And a big shift again from K-12 is that students that receive that accommodation letter, those approved accommodations, it's then their responsibility to talk with their faculty about them. So faculty are not automatically notified if a student has accommodations because it's really the student's choice if they want to utilize accommodations in each class. They might be in a class that's primarily class discussion and they don't feel like they need it. And so they're not going to identify that they have accommodations to that faculty, but they might be in an intro to communication class and have lots of need in that one. So it really, the onus becomes on the student and they have to provide that letter of accommodation to their faculty. I would encourage students to talk with their disability services staff member about how to have those conversations. It's important to not just pass them a piece of paper and hope that it goes well, but to share a little bit about what they think they need in that class, how they can be successful, and have a bit of a conversation. So this tends to be a pretty new process for our students with disabilities and can feel really daunting if they don't know it in advance. So hopefully this gives you some steps to talk through with your students as they prepare. Some important things to note is that it is not always a quick process to receive accommodations from disability services. They require time to review your documentation, to schedule a meeting with you to determine the appropriate accommodations, get you the letter. So sometimes that can be lengthy. So we would encourage students to do this early, before classes start, to kind of get the ball rolling so that they start off on a good foot rather than feeling like they're starting behind without accommodations in place. I also encourage students to maintain open communication with their staff in the Disability Services office, because an accommodation letter can be a living and breathing document. Disability can be living and breathing. We might experience something like a concussion that causes more need for different accommodations, and the students should go back to their Disability Services office staff and say, hey, this thing happened and I need more. And so then they can update that accommodation letter and then prepare them to share with their staff. So having open communication, making sure that they're staying in contact with that staff member, is really important and really vital for their success. Yeah, and this kind of speaks to just continually advocating for what their needs are as they evolve and change. And then noting that there are procedures for these accommodations. Things don't just happen automatically. There's lots of responsibility placed on the student. So a big example of this is testing center requests. So if a student has testing center accommodations, extended time, can take it in a private room, they can't just assume that when a test is scheduled in their class for one of their courses, that they're going to have a seat to go take that in the testing center. Instead, they have to read through their syllabus in advance. They have to look at the testing center and typically schedule that a week in advance before their exam. So they have to be on top of it, which tends to be overwhelming if they're not prepared for that again. And so making sure that students know that there are procedures and things in place that they're going to have to be aware of early on. So I'm going to speak to just some of the key differences that we're going to see from high school to higher education. And I've talked a bit about these already, so I'll kind of blaze through a few of them. But under the laws, essentially, in high school, students are supported by the IDEA or IDEA law that supports disability services or special education services. And that law and those services are really in place for students with disabilities to be successful. So their language is to do anything that they can to make sure that students are successful. In college, under the ADA and the 504, the language is access. So instead of ensuring that students with disabilities have success, they're just ensuring that they have access. And then success is up to them, how they utilize additional supports, how they communicate, how they work, all of those pieces. So receiving accommodations in higher education does not guarantee success in their courses. It just ensures that they have equal access to be able to participate as fully as possible as any other student. And so that language is kind of, fundamentally very different, and is important to note and prepare for. In high school, as I mentioned, those accommodations and modifications tend to be provided, concocted, determined by an IEP team, and then just kind of provided to students. Whereas in the college level, that student has to own that process, and they're only able to access those appropriate accommodations. There's going to be lots of structure in their high school day and when they go from class to class, etc. And when they get to college, a lot less structure, more downtime, and inevitably that means more choice for students, more natural consequences for students and decision making. And that's just important to note that the disability services staff are not going to be as hands-on or eyes-on as a special education staff would be in the high school level. These are students that are treated as their same as their neurotypical peers, adults pursuing their future, and so they're going to be treated as such. At the high school level, when there's a high need for understanding specific content, they often offer specialized instruction, people that are going to sit down with that student and really walk through that content with them. At the college level, really their encouragement is not that specialized instruction, but to utilize services that are across the campus, like tutoring and things like that. So accessing normative supports across the campus to help them better understand the content in their courses. We also see a really big shift from parents being the primary advocate and somebody that has lots of hands-on support and input into the process for their students. Where at college, the student becomes their own their own advocate. And the parents, while they still have a vital role of supporting their student, they are not going to be the one that is communicated with directly. You'll hear a lot at colleges that nothing about the student without the student. So disability services staff don't have meetings with parents without the student involved. Parents don't have the opportunity to reach out to faculty. The student really becomes the funnel through all of that communication so that they're taking ownership and they're aware of the things that are going on and are responsible for those pieces. And you'll also see a big shift in how records are shown or how information is shown. And so typically students have to complete a release of information form if they want their parent to be able to access their grades, information about their accommodations, things like that. That's not going to be automatic for parents. And so that's a big conversation piece for some of our students and their families. And it's just important to know that that's something that disability services will stand on and be really passionate about. That the student is the one that we really speak through and make sure that they're calling the shots and running the show. There's lots of differences, I'm sure you guys can imagine, between high school and college. And so there's a link down at the bottom of this slide from Think College that breaks down even a bit more of the differences that you're going to see. And that is a really helpful document just to roll through with students to help them consider what are some of those changes they're going to experience. And I'm going to run through these just really quickly because there can be lots of questions and nuances in this, but this just speaks to some of those differences from high school to college. There's also really clear rights and responsibilities that is put on the students and also put on faculty and staff at the college level. So students have the right to have their diagnosis be confidential. So when they self-disclose to a disability services office, they do have to identify what their disability is to that staff member, but nobody else needs to know what that diagnosis is unless the student decides to share it. The staff and faculty across campus, what they need to know is what accommodations they need to provide to the student and how it might impact them day to day in their classroom. But so on that accommodation letter, it's not going to state a diagnosis because that's not important information for other people to know. It's really up to the student who knows that information. Because of that, they should be receiving equal treatment. That means that they should be graded equally as their peers, communicated with the same way, all of those things that they're an equal participant in the college experience. I mentioned this before, but students get to choose if they utilize their approved accommodations. I've had several students receive accommodation letters and not ask for them in their classes, and that's really up to them. I don't recommend that. I encourage students to start with accommodations in place and taper those off as needed, but they really get the choice of when they request them and when they don't. It's important for them to speak up for their needs, as I mentioned, to keep on coming back to disability services and communicate about their needs. And then also to be able to complete a grievance form if they ever feel like they didn't have equal treatment or there was discrimination because of their disability. There are different ways for students to do that at each institution, but it's important for them to know that they can speak up if they ever feel like that has happened. On the flip side of those rights, they have responsibilities. So students have to follow the same code of conduct as any other student. They have to meet those essential requirements of the course. Those can't be modified for them. And they have to provide that accommodation letter. So they can't just assume that accommodations are provided to them. And they can't be retroactive. So if a student forgets to provide an accommodation letter until the first exam in a class, it sometimes could take up to a week to get accommodations in place. And so they're not going to be guaranteed those accommodations for that first exam. So it's really important for them to take responsibility of providing that early on. Flip side, faculty and staff, they do have the right to receive that accommodation letter as their notification to support students. They can't assume a student needs an accommodation and just provide it. So they have the right to request that. To discuss accommodations with the students. It doesn't have to be, like I said, just passing of a paper. They should have that conversation and ask what they might need in the classroom, discuss ways that they can best be prepared for exams, things like that. They do have the right to only provide what's identified on that accommodation letter. So sometimes students say, well, maybe we can do this too with faculty, and they are not required to do any additional accommodations and are generally encouraged not to do that, to really only go by what's been approved by the Disability Services Office. And then they have access to the Disability Services office if they have questions or concerns about what accommodations have been approved and why. If they ever feel like it is altering something in their course, then they can go pursue that conversation with disability services. And there might be some tweaking and collaborating to figure out what's going to be most appropriate for the student in that course. And then they have the right to grade fairly. So students with accommodations are not guaranteed passing grades, which sometimes tends to be the assumption in high school or in K-12. So the rigor is going to be the same level and the standards are going to be the same as their peers. And then the responsibility of these faculty and staff is that they actually implement those approved accommodations. So if they're provided an accommodation letter, it's their responsibility to make sure they're working with disability services to ensure that students have alternate formats for their books, or that they have access to the exam when they're in the testing center, things like that. And then they are required to maintain confidentiality. So a student that's going to share an accommodation letter with a faculty member, that should be a one-on-one conversation, and faculty are not allowed to say, oh yes, you with the accommodations in my class, did you get that test scheduled? Because that is breaking confidentiality. So they should really be maintaining that confidentiality so that students feel comfortable in their class. So that is disability services, that bigger, broad umbrella. Now, a little bit more nuanced is our supplemental disability services. And after I talk about these supplemental ones, I'm going to jump to inclusive higher ed, but I'll break for some questions because I know there can be a lot here. So this is our middle ground services, students that would still access all of those supports that I mentioned in disability services, those traditional ones, but need a bit more on that social organizational component. So they're going to still go through those same procedures of disclosing to disability services office, getting an accommodation letter. All of those pieces are the same for them, but they might then request or be approved for, be able to access a few more supports like academic coaching. So this is not going to be something that's typically offered in a disability services office. So this tends to come from a more specified program where they sit down with students and they talk about what are your academic goals, what are your struggles, what are your strengths, and what are some strategies that we can come up with together to help you be successful in your courses. A lot of times these programs include some peer mentoring pieces. So maybe students meet with a peer mentor, a neurotypical peer from their college a couple times a week to talk about how are things going in your classes? Are you understanding what your faculty has been talking about? Do you know how to navigate the online portal? Things like that, where they just kind of have some natural guidance from a peer that has gone through it before. And then sometimes there is some supported skill development, which might come in the form of a specialized course where they're able to go get specialized content from the program, or it might just come with one-on-one guidance and just kind of continual check-ins with staff members. And some of the skills that we tend to see be focused on in these programs include social engagement. So maybe they're going to meet with the staff to talk about which social events they want to go to this semester and how they can best engage with students there. What are some strategies for them if they get anxious in big group settings, things like that. So they might get skill development specifically on the social front or on the executive functioning front. This is a huge one for all college students, if we're being honest, to be able to navigate their schedule and navigate 5 different syllabi and all of the assignments that come with that, reminders for when to complete their reading assignments, things like that. There's so much going on that's new and is now their responsibility. And so being able to have some coaching on how to navigate a schedule, what scheduling technology is going to be the best for you, that can be really personalized within these supplemental programs where they can talk through strategies for each student. There might be some support for independent living. So if students are living on campus and really struggle with day-to-day functioning, like brushing teeth or waking up to an alarm, things like that, these programs might be able to provide some support in those particular skills to help students feel ready to live independently. And I'll speak to kind of the nuances of each program, but that's a common category. And then career readiness. This tends to be a focus of, hey, I'm a student with a disability, I'm receiving these services, but I really don't know where I'm headed. I don't know what career outcome I want. And so these programs tend to be able to help students kind of conceptualize what's going to be the most appropriate for you. What are some, options in our region that are going to be helpful for you, and they can be a little bit more specialized in what students might need. And then at the base level, just goal setting. Sometimes this is really helpful for students just to be able to have a point person that they come to set goals academically, socially, when it comes to career, whatever it might be. And then there also could be some support with emotional regulation. Sometimes having a specific office or like meeting place for peers that are in these programs can help with some of that emotional regulation, but they can have some direct instruction on how to navigate all of the emotions, mental health pieces that come with college. This is like a big asterisk that I just want to focus on. Supplemental programs are so different from one another. There's not really one set model for how supplemental services operate. And so it takes some research, and it takes figuring out which one's going to be the best fit for you. So I'm going to speak to which ones exist here in Colorado. And I have these in two different categories. One is institutional. So those are programs that are housed at the college. And then some are external, which are they support students across the state. So some of our college supplemental programs, we have one at CSU called Opportunities for Post-Secondary Success. And this tends to look a lot more like that peer mentorship, regular meetings, just to help students stay on track. That tends to be like one of their big components that they offer support in. And we have DU's Learning Effectiveness Program, and they have some additional support when it comes to academic guidance, that academic coaching, determining which courses are the most appropriate for them. And I would again say that their focus is more of that one-on-one mentoring that students have access to, more so than students that are just using disability services. And then MSU has a program that's referred to as ISAC, Integrated Supports for Students with ASD in College. So they're specific to students with autism. It's worthwhile reaching out to them to see if there's any flex with their diagnoses and if students don't have to have that ASD diagnosis. But by and large, these supplemental programs are geared towards students with autism. And so they really work with students with the social engagement and the organizational piece, some of those struggles that tend to come with students with ASD. So those are common ones at institutions here in Colorado. And these are all links to their web pages so that you can see a bit more about those nuances. Some external ones that exist, there's one called Untapped Learning. This really primarily it's a virtual support system that offers executive functioning guidance for students that are pursuing college anywhere across the state. So they might have virtual meetings with a peer mentor to set up, schedules and to set up organizational strategies and things like that. And then there's also one called College Living Experience. This one is really harps on the independent living piece. So they offer a removed independent living environment for students with disabilities that want to pursue college, where they're able to develop independent living skills amongst that environment and amongst some support while pursuing college. And so they're really focused on that independent living piece. So that's a lot of information, and I can speak forever about inclusive higher education, but I want to press pause just to ask if there's any questions about those first two categories, traditional disability services or supplemental disability services, that I could speak to. Awesome. Okay, and I did see a comment in the chat. It looks like the parent that had specific questions about inclusive higher ed dropped off. Is that right, Elise? Okay, no worries. Alrighty, well, if any questions pop up, feel free to send them in. I'm going to go ahead and speak now towards that more intensive need, which is inclusive higher education programs. So inclusive higher education programs are beyond compliant, meaning that they go above and beyond what's required at institutions of higher education to make sure that we're creating new pathways for students that otherwise would not have access to college. And primarily that's coming through their modification option, but we'll talk a bit more about the other ways that they offer support too. So inclusive higher education programs provide alternative admission pathways. So students don't have to complete that traditional admission process. They get access to accommodations and modifications, which makes it far more accessible to a lot of the students that we work with. And they earn a certificate credential so that they're not pursuing the same level of an associate's or a bachelor's degree, but they're intentionally taking courses that are going to help them build up specific skills for a career goal, and then receiving a certificate that shows that they were in those classes, but identifies that there was modified content that they completed. It still is very inclusive and formative. So this is not special education classrooms on a college campus. Students are taking classes with their peers at the college level and receiving these additional supports kind of on the back end, almost in the background in a lot of ways, to be able to have equal access. So there's going to be staff and peer mentor support in 4 big domains: academics, social, career, and independence. And we've kind of talked about all of these within those first 2 categories, where students might get support in career or they might get support in social engagement. The unique piece of inclusive higher education is they get support in all of those 4 categories, period. It's all essential to their program. They can't skirt around getting career development skills. They have to do that. It's part of their program requirements. And so this is something, there is a clear model in our inclusive higher education programs where students in these programs receive supports in all of those areas. So I'm going to speak to some of our common supports in those key areas, just so you can understand a bit better. When it comes to, and we'll talk a little bit more about the academic piece, but students with their accommodations and their modifications, they still get access to the full course catalog. Okay, so they're not limited to just a few select classes that are able to be modified. They get to look at the course catalog and say, what's going to be the best for my skill development, for my career outcome, and then a program staff works with their faculty to modify the expectations of that course. And so their certificate gets to be really focused on what their career outcome is, their area of study. And then there's still high standards for these students, even with modifications in place. So we're still going to challenge them more than they likely have been in the K-12 environment. They're going to be challenged in a lot of new ways, and oftentimes fading supports academically so that they can continue growing. On the social front, students have access to campus as any other student would, but a lot of times it's supported by peer mentors going with them to social events, helping them engage a little bit more organically. They might have some opportunities to learn about social interaction and kind of talk through those things with peer mentors, but a lot of it is them given opportunity to go to events, to go to clubs, to take on leadership roles, and to ask for support while they're there. And then the career piece is, during these programs, students have a progression of career readiness. So they're going to be exploring career options first, and then doing some job shadows, and then internships, and then paid employment on campus, and ideally paid employment off campus by the time that they complete their program. And then they're all going to be focused on growing independent skills, whether that's living on campus and having support in the dorms to be able to brush their teeth and wake up to an alarm or navigate roommate conflict. Or if they don't have on-campus living, or if they choose not to live on campus, they still can have direct instruction. So to develop independent life skills. So all of these programs, what they offer is one course that's focused on just direct instruction and skill development for the students in their program. And that's kind of the only piece that feels a little bit more like a special education classroom, because it's a bit more removed, but it's to make sure that they have instruction in money management and living independently and transportation, all of those pieces. And that's all kind of wrapped up into some self-advocacy that these programs really focus on for our students. So the way that students access these programs is they have to apply to the program directly and then be admitted to the institution, as I mentioned before. And once they're there, they're going to receive guidance on an orientation process that's a little bit earlier than most students, so that they can have some preparation on campus, navigate that with their program staff. They're going to go through a person-centered planning meeting with program staff to determine what they're after, what their purpose is for being in these programs. So that might be a career goal, what their area of study is, what courses they need. And then they're going to coordinate what services are going to be appropriate. Those are beyond compliance services. So not just accommodations, but what are the modifications? What peer mentors need to go with you to classes? Or do we need to have scheduled time after class for you to meet with peer mentors to make sure that you're understanding what's going on in your class? Things like that, and anything that you might need in the housing environment. This is still a very interactive process where students have to take ownership of what they need as well. So real quick, when we talk about modifications at the college level, just as a reminder, these programs and only inclusive higher education programs allow for modified content where we're changing what learning occurs. We're changing some of those expectations, and it's coordinated by the program staff, not the faculty. So the program staff determine what accommodations and modifications are required, and they're then implementing them. So some common modifications we see is a limited length of assignment. So instead of 5 pages, maybe we're working on 1-page assignment. Maybe that's not within their realm of possibility, and so they're working on a graphic organizer that shows what they learned, or 5 slides in a PowerPoint to show what they learned from a reading. So it's a different kind of assessment. For tests, maybe they are being asked fewer questions, or maybe somebody can read the questions aloud to them and kind of explain what the question is asking, things like that. And then under housing, a common modification is just additional support. So having peer mentors come in or an RA come in to offer guidance. This is an example of a modified assignment at the college level. Just for sake of time, I'm not going to roll through it, but it's there for you to kind of reference how it looks for students to complete modified assignments in college. And this is a look at a certificate, that certificate outcome. What I will note is that any student that's receiving a modified certificate, their transcript identifies that classes were modified, or that they were a part of this particular program. And because of that, those courses can only be transferred to other inclusive higher education programs. So as we're looking at all of those categories, if students ever want to say, hey, I no longer need this intensive inclusive higher education support, and they want to pursue an associate's degree, they're going to have to go back and retake those courses that are not modified to be able to attain that. Yeah, so this is just a peek at students taking only 2 courses per semester. So it's far more limited than most students on a college campus, and they really get to choose from across the course catalog to focus on their particular career goal. So even with those supports in place, even with modifications, there's an increased responsibility from their K-12 experience. It's still student driven. There's still high expectations for them and challenge for them in a lot of ways. And we seek an inclusive higher education to fade that support over time so that students can be more and more independent. And so we encourage preparation for that early on. So I'm just going to speak to which of the schools in Colorado have inclusive higher education programs, and then we'll pause for questions. So we have Elevate, a community college in Littleton, Colorado at a ACC. They're a commuter campus, so no on-campus living, and theirs is a 3-year program. UCCS in Colorado Springs is a 4-year program, and they have on-campus apartments. UNC in Greeley, Colorado is also a 4-year program, and they are in more traditional dorms. And then Global at Regis University in Denver. Theirs is a unique model that you can have 1, 2, or 3-year pathways at their program, and they do have on-campus living options as well. All of these programs, students that are enrolled in them have access to financial aid. And we go into a lot more depth about what these programs offer and some of the financial questions in a few other webinars. So just know that they have access to completing a FAFSA, but there are some nuances to that. And all of them have that same certificate, that comprehensive higher education certificate, are consistent across these programs. And then we are in the process of welcoming CSU in Fort Collins, Colorado. They're going to have a program launching this fall, specifically around agriculture and agriculture trade in their area. And then MSU Denver is also launching a program this coming fall. And we've got a couple more coming down the pike in the next year or so. So it's continuing to grow to make sure that we're offering support to students with intellectual disabilities. So those are all of the categories, and I know it can be a lot to process. And sometimes there are students that might need supports across all of them, and it can feel hard to navigate where they fall. So I encourage parents and families and educators and students to talk about this early on. And I'm just going to leave up here on the screen while I open for questions some examples of students that fall into these categories, what kinds of supports they had in high school, and maybe what their goals are and which category is best for them. So we can kind of speak to that in a little bit, but I do want to pause before you guys all sign off at 6 o'clock and see if there's any specific questions that anybody wants to ask me about these different categories of support. Okay, I know it can be a lot to take in. What I would encourage, if you feel like you have a student that might fall in the gray area of these categories and you don't know where to start, have a conversation with us, reach out to disability services staff at the college that they're interested in, and just kind of talk through what it would look like. Don't feel like you have to figure that out on your own, because that can feel overwhelming. But hopefully this gives some categories of where you can start, and what you can pursue moving forward. And ultimately, no matter which category students fall into, there's really a movement for collaboration across campus. So even when students are in that far category of inclusive higher education programs, they're still connected with disability services and the testing center and counseling center on campus. So there's still this interconnectedness across campus. Same thing with those supplemental programs and traditional disability services. We still want students to utilize all of the resources available to them to be successful and to have the most normative process or experience in college as possible. So we have links to resources for you guys, continued webinars that we're providing. But what I want to point you to specifically is the second link here called the Levels of Support document. This kind of breaks down those 3 levels, and then it gives lists of those supplemental programs as well as the inclusive higher education programs for you to click on and to go to their websites and to find out more. So I encourage you to go through that. And again, you'll have that provided to you tomorrow morning. And then there's some national resources specifically surrounding inclusive higher education, because that's a newer piece of these disability services. So this will kind of speak to some of the resources available nationally for you to check out. And so right after, when we conclude this webinar, you guys will get a little pop-up saying, hey, complete this feedback survey for us. So we just encourage you to do that. We'll throw that link in our follow-up email for you as well, but would love your feedback, your input. And we do look at those responses. And if you have anything that you're like, hey, I still have questions about this, we'll follow up with you directly to make sure that you get that information so that you're as resourced as possible. That's my goal. So thank you for listening to me ramble at you for a whole hour. I hope it was helpful. I hope it gives you some resources to move forward. I'm going to hang tight and go ahead and stop our recording. So if anybody wants to ask questions offline, you're more than welcome to do so.